Imagine the silence, a deep, heavy silence in the damp forests of the Ardennes. You hear nothing but your own breathing, and the faint snap of a twig under an enemy's boot. You're holding a rifle, but not just any rifle. You're holding a legend, and then that sound, that high-pitched metallic ring echoing through the chaos of battle. It was the most beautiful music to an American GI, but the ultimate nightmare for the man on the other side of the barrel. Today, we aren't just talking about a weapon. We are talking about the machine that changed the course of history. General George S. Patton called it the greatest battle implement ever devised, and he wasn't exaggerating. While German and Japanese soldiers had to manually bolt their rifles after every single shot, struggling with heavy, slow actions, the American soldier just kept pulling the trigger. 1, 2, 5, 8 rounds. Speed, power, death. But how did this semi-automatic beast actually work? John Cantius Garand, the man behind this monster, wasn't just an engineer. He was a genius. He designed a system that used the very gases from the bullet to eject the empty casing and slam a fresh one into the chamber. In less than a fraction of a second, in a world where one missed shot meant the end, the M1, Garand gave a soldier a second chance, and a third, and an eighth. But that eighth round, it held a secret that became the stuff of battlefield myth. To understand why the M1 Garand was such a game changer, you have to look at what the rest of the world was carrying in 1941. Most German soldiers were armed with the Karabiner 98K. It was accurate, yes. It was reliable, definitely. But it was a bolt-action rifle. After every shot, the German soldier had to take his hand off the trigger, pull the bolt back, push it forward, and reacquire his target. In the heat of a firefight, those seconds feel like hours. Now enter the GI with his Garand. He didn't have to move a muscle except for his index finger. While the German was struggling with his bolt, the American could suppress an entire squad by himself. This was the birth of fire superiority, but the real magic and the real controversy was the loading system. Unlike other rifles of the era that used internal magazines or detachable boxes, the Garand used the en bloc clip. You didn't load individual bullets. You slammed an entire 8-round steel clip into the top of the rifle. Sound effect, heavy metallic slam and click. It was fast, it was brutal, but it had a catch. You couldn't easily top off the magazine. If you had 3 rounds left and wanted a full clip for the next building, you either had to fire them off or manually eject the partially full clip. A clunky process in the middle of a war zone. And then, there's the Garand Thumb. If you weren't careful when loading that clip, the heavy bolt would slam forward with enough force to crush your thumb against the receiver. It was a painful rite of passage for every recruit. But none of that compared to the legend of the ping. The myth goes like this. When the last round was fired, the steel clip would fly out of the rifle, hitting the ground with a distinct metallic ring. People say that German soldiers would wait for that sound, knowing the American was empty, and then they would rush. But was it a death sentence or a deadly trap set by the Americans? Now let's talk about the legend that has fueled thousands of internet arguments, the ping. The story goes that the M1 Garand was actually a dangerous weapon for the user. Why? Because when that steel clip ejected with a loud ping, it told every German or Japanese soldier in the area that the American was out of ammo. In Hollywood movies, you see the enemy waiting for the sound, then jumping out of their hole to charge. But is it true? Ask any real combat veteran, and they'll likely laugh. In the middle of a chaotic firefight, with artillery exploding, machine guns roaring, and men screaming, do you really think anyone could hear a tiny piece of steel hitting the mud 30 yards away? Probably not, and even if they did hear it, the American soldier wasn't alone. He had a squad. If one Garand was empty, 4 others were still firing. In fact, some veterans claim they turned the ping into a deadly trap. They would carry an empty clip and throw it against a rock to make the sound, waiting for a curious enemy to peek out. Sound effect, metallic ping, followed by a loud gunshot. Whether the myth is... But the story of the Garand doesn't end on the front lines of World War II. As the war progressed, the military realized this platform could do even more. They began developing specialized versions like the M1C and M1D sniper variants. Imagine being a sniper in the 1940s. Most snipers used bolt-action rifles because they were thought to be more accurate. But with the Garand sniper variants, an American marksman didn't have to break his position to reload after every shot. He could keep his eye on the scope, stay perfectly still, and send 8 precision rounds downrange in seconds. It was a terrifying evolution of the platform. Even after the atomic bombs dropped and the world celebrated peace, the M1, Garand didn't retire. It went on to fight in the frozen hills of Korea, where it faced a new enemy and even harsher conditions. Veterans of the Korean War often talked about how the Garand was the only thing they could trust when the temperature dropped like so low that other weapons simply froze solid. The Garand was more than just steel and wood to these men, it was a companion. Soldiers would spend hours cleaning it, obsessing over every spring and pin. They knew that their life depended on that ping sounding at the right moment. Eventually, the world moved on to the M14 and the M16, but the Garand never truly vanished. Today, it is one of the most sought-after collector's items in the world. Why? Because when you hold an M1 Garand, you aren't just holding a rifle. You are holding the weight of the men who climbed the cliffs of Normandy. You are holding the echoes of the Pacific jungles. So, was it perfect? No, it was heavy. It could crush your thumb, and it made a loud noise when it was empty. But it was the right tool at the right time. It was the hammer of democracy. But to truly understand the weight of the M1 Garand, we have to leave the European theater and head into the claustrophobic green hell of the Pacific. Here, the war was different. It wasn't about tanks moving across open fields, it was about inches. It was about hidden tunnels, camouflaged snipers, and the terrifying screams of a banzai charge in the middle of the night. Japanese soldiers were often armed with the Arisaka Type 99. Like the German Kar 98K, it was a bolt-action rifle. In the dense jungles of Guadalcanal or Iwo Jima, where visibility was sometimes less than 10 feet, the Arisaka had a fatal flaw: its rate of fire. When a wave of Japanese soldiers charged out of the darkness, an American Marine didn't have time to work a bolt. He needed volume. The Garand provided exactly that. A single Marine could hold a defensive line against 5, 10, or even 15 attackers because he could keep his sights on the enemy while his semi-automatic fire did the work. The Japanese military was actually shocked by this. Early in the war, their intelligence reports suggested that every American soldier was carrying a light machine gun. They couldn't believe a standard-issue infantry rifle could spit out lead that fast. But the jungle was a cruel master. The humidity was 90%. The mud was thick enough to swallow a jeep. In these conditions, many weapons failed. Springs rusted, wood swelled, and mechanisms jammed. Yet, the Garand earned its reputation for being marine-proof. As long as you kept the internal track greased, even with something as basic as axle grease from a nearby truck, the rifle would cycle. Marine veterans often spoke of the reassuring weight of the wood and steel. At nearly 10 pounds, it wasn't a light weapon. But when the ammo ran out and the fighting became hand-to-hand, which happened more often in the Pacific than anywhere else, that weight became an advantage. With a 10-inch bayonet fixed to the end, the M1 Garand transformed from a high-tech rifle into a deadly spear. It was a brutal, primitive end to a high-tech story. While the soldiers were fighting in the mud, another war was being won thousands of miles away in the factories of Springfield Armory and Winchester. To understand why the M1 Garand was a symbol of American victory, you have to look at the sheer scale of its production. At the start of the war, the US military was tiny and their weapon supplies were even smaller. But once the arsenal of democracy kicked into gear, the numbers became staggering. By 1945, over 5.4 million M1 Garands had been produced. Think about that for a second. While Germany was struggling to simplify their rifles to save steel and Japan was using wood from furniture to finish their stocks, the United States was churning out millions of high-precision, semi-automatic machines. But it wasn't easy. The M1 Garand was notoriously difficult to manufacture compared to a simple bolt-action rifle. It required precise machining, high-quality steel alloys, and a complicated gas system that had to be perfect to avoid jamming. Each rifle went through rigorous testing. If a rifle failed to cycle just once during its factory test, it was sent back. The lives of millions of men depended on these machines, and the workers in the factories knew it. One of the most interesting parts of the Garand's production history is the Winchester Garands. Because of the urgent need for weapons, the government contracted Winchester Repeating Arms to help Springfield Armory. However, Winchester used different tooling and slightly different machining processes. Today, collectors can spot a Winchester Garand just by looking at the finish and the machining marks on the receiver. These variations are what make the Garand a goldmine for history buffs. Every scratch and every serial number tells a story of a specific factory, a specific month, and a specific battle. And then, there was the evolution of the gas system. Early models used what collectors call a gas trap system. It was complicated and prone to carbon buildup. If the Army had stuck with that design, the Garand might have been a disaster in the field. But John Garand and his team pivoted. They redesigned it into the gas port system we know today, where a small hole is drilled directly into the barrel to bleed off gas. It was simpler, more reliable, and it turned the M1 into the legendary workhorse that could survive the sands of North Africa and the humidity of the Philippines. This constant improvement is what separated the US military from its enemies. They weren't just mass-producing a weapon, they were perfecting it in real time, based on the blood-soaked reports coming back from the front lines. When a soldier reported a problem with the rear sight or the safety, the engineers in Springfield had a solution on the assembly line within weeks. This was industrial warfare at its peak. But beyond the stats, the ping, and the factory numbers, there is something deeper. To the men who fought from 1941 to 1945, the M1 Garand wasn't just a piece of government property. It was the difference between seeing their families again or becoming a name on a white cross in a foreign field. There are countless stories of veterans who, decades after the war, would visit museums or gun shows just to hold a Garand one last time. They don't talk about the Garand Thumb or the heavy weight. They remember the sound of the bolt slamming home in a dark foxhole. They remember the cold steel against their cheek. For them, this rifle was a witness to the most terrifying and the most heroic moments of their lives. The M1 Garand was the weapon that broke the back of tyranny. It was the voice of a nation that refused to lose. It may be retired now, replaced by lighter, faster, and more modern rifles, but it will never be forgotten. Because as long as we remember the ping, we remember the men who carried it. Change to upbeat, professional tone for the outro. If you made it this far, you're a true history fan. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the legend of the M1 Garand. Now, I want to hear from you. If you could own any rifle from World War II, would it be the Garand or would you pick something else? Let me know in the comments. I read every single one. Don't forget to hit that like button if you learned something today. It's the best way to support the channel and help us grow our historical archive. And if you haven't already, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We have some massive stories coming up that you won't want to miss. This has been your source for the untold stories of history. Until next time, keep the history alive. Dismissed.